In the spring of 1618, a group of Protestant noblemen in the Kingdom of Bohemia walked into a castle in Prague, held a trial, and threw 3 royal officials out of a 3rd-floor window. All 3 survived the fall, broken, according to Catholic accounts, by divine intervention, and according to Protestant witnesses, by a pile of refuse below. That single act of defiance, known to history as the Defenestration of Prague, did not cause the 30 Years' War, but it lit the fuse of a conflict that had been accumulating pressure for generations across the Jews, a Holy Roman Empire, and the broader continent of Europe. Asterisk. What followed over the next 3 decades would reshape the political map of Europe, reduce the population of entire German territories by 1/3 or more, and fundamentally alter how states understood sovereignty, religious authority, and the limits of imperial power. Contemporary records from affected regions describe not a single unified war, but a cascading series of overlapping conflicts, religious, dynastic, territorial, and constitutional, that drew in nearly every significant power on the continent, before they were finally brought to a close in 1648. If you find value in structured, evidence-based explorations of early modern European history, consider subscribing to History in Depth. New documentaries are released regularly, and each one follows this same commitment to historical accuracy and measured analysis. To understand why the 30 Years' War was so destructive and why it matters, it is necessary to first understand the world that produced it. Europe in the early 17th century was not a continent of clearly defined nations in the modern sense. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, principalities, bishoprics, free cities, and feudal territories held together and frequently pulled apart by competing claims of faith, lineage, and law. At the center of this structure stood the Holy Roman Empire, a vast and internally fractured political entity stretching across much of Central Europe, nominally ruled by an elected emperor, but in practice composed of hundreds of semi-autonomous territories with their own rulers, courts, and religious allegiances. The religious dimension of this world cannot be overstated. The Protestant Reformation, launched in the previous century, had never been resolved. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 had established a fragile framework, allowing princes to determine the religion of their territories, but it had left unresolved the status of Calvinist communities and had done nothing to quiet the deeper anxieties on both sides of the confessional divide. By 1618, that framework was visibly straining. Catholic and Protestant factions within the empire had formed rival military alliances. The Habsburg dynasty, which controlled both the imperial throne and the thrones of Spain, Austria, and Bohemia, was committed to the reinvigoration of Catholic authority. And in Bohemia, a Protestant majority was watching a new king, the future Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand, to move systematically to curtail the religious freedoms they had held for decades. What began in Prague would not end in Prague. The Holy Roman Empire that stood at the center of the 30 Years' War was, by the early 17th century, one of the most structurally complex political entities in the world. Its full title, the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, hinted at the contradictions built into its foundations. It was neither fully holy nor straightforwardly Roman, nor governed as a unified nation. What it was in practice was a constitutional arrangement of extraordinary fragility, held together by tradition, legal custom, and the constant negotiation of competing interests. At its apex sat the Holy Roman Emperor, a title that was elective rather than hereditary, chosen by a body of powerful princes and archbishops known as the imperial electors. The Habsburg dynasty had held the title continuously since the 15th century, but that continuity masked the limits of imperial authority. The emperor could not legislate unilaterally, could not raise taxes across the empire without consent, and could not deploy military force without navigating a web of princely prerogatives. Real power was distributed, often contested, among the hundreds of territorial rulers who owed nominal allegiance to the emperor while governing their own lands with considerable independence. This structure had produced a political culture defined by negotiation, legal argument, and institutional deadlock. The imperial diet, the empire's deliberative assembly, brought together representatives of the major territories to debate legislation and resolve disputes. But by the early 1600s, That body had become increasingly paralyzed by the confessional divide between Catholic and Protestant members. Decisions that required consensus rarely achieved it. Grievances accumulated without resolution. Compounding this institutional strain was the constitutional ambiguity surrounding Bohemia itself. The Kingdom of Bohemia was a hereditary possession of the Habsburgs, but Bohemian nobles maintained that their kingdom operated under distinct rights and customs, including meaningful limits on royal authority and, critically, protections for Protestant worship enshrined in a document known as the Letter of Majesty, granted in 1609, when Ferdinand II moved to curtail those protections following his accession to the Bohemian throne. He understood himself to be restoring legitimate Catholic order. The Bohemian nobility understood it as a violation of a binding constitutional compact. That collision of interpretations, each side confident in the legal and moral legitimacy of its position, was not unique to Bohemia. It reflected a structural crisis running through the entire imperial system. The Peace of Augsburg had attempted to freeze a religious and political settlement that neither side fully accepted. Administrative documents from the period reveal ongoing disputes over church properties, episcopal appointments, and the application of Augsburg's provisions to territories and communities the original agreement had not clearly addressed. The revolt that erupted in Bohemia in 1618 was, at its core, a constitutional dispute made explosive by religious conviction. But it would not remain confined to Bohemia for long. The same fault lines ran through the broader empire and beyond, and the powers that surrounded the empire, France, Spain, Sweden, Denmark, and the Dutch Republic, each had reasons of their own to watch the unfolding crisis with close and calculating attention. The political and religious frameworks that produced the 30 Years' War were experienced by ordinary people not as abstract constitutional arguments, but as immediate, material disruptions to the rhythms of daily existence. For the vast majority of the population living across the territories of the Holy Roman Empire in the early 17th century, life was organized around agriculture, local trade, and the social structures of village and town. It was a world in which the passage of armies, regardless of which side they served, represented one of the most serious threats a community could face. Contemporary accounts and administrative records from the period describe an agrarian society already operating under considerable strain before the war began. Population growth in the preceding century had pressed against the limits of available farmland in many regions. Harvests were vulnerable to the climatic deterioration that historians now associate with the broader period known as the Little Ice Age, a long interval of cooling temperatures that brought erratic growing seasons, crop failures, and recurring subsistence crises across much of northern and central Europe. In this environment, the economic margins available to ordinary farming households were narrow. A single bad harvest could push a family toward destitution. 2 consecutive failures could empty a village. Into this fragile landscape, the war introduced pressures of a different and more violent order. The armies of the early 17th century were not supplied by efficient state logistical systems. They were largely self-provisioning forces that extracted what they needed: food, fodder, horses, shelter, labor directly from the populations through whose territories they passed. The practice of quartering soldiers in civilian homes, requisitioning grain stores, and seizing livestock was not an aberration of military conduct, but a structural feature of how warfare was financed and sustained during this period. Primary sources from affected communities record the repeated passage of both friendly and hostile forces as economically indistinguishable in their consequences. Both took what they required. Towns occupied a somewhat different position within this structure. Urban centers in the empire ranged from the great imperial free cities Frankfurt, Augsburg, Nuremberg with their sophisticated merchant communities, craft guilds, and municipal governments, to modest market towns serving the agricultural hinterlands around them. Trade networks connecting these centers had developed steadily over the preceding 2 centuries, and the early decades of the 17th century had seen continued commercial activity across the Rhine and Danube corridors. Scholarly consensus places the empire's urban economy, on the eve of the war, in a condition of moderate but uneven prosperity. with significant regional variation in wealth, manufacturing capacity, and exposure to international markets. What the war would do to these networks, urban and rural, alike was not immediate, but cumulative. The disruption of trade routes, the destruction of productive agricultural land, the flight of population from repeatedly plundered territories, and the collapse of local administrative capacity combined over years and decades to produce economic damage that outlasted the conflict itself by a generation. Parish records and tax registers from the hardest-hit regions document population losses that reduced some districts to a fraction of their pre-war size, losses attributable not only to direct violence, but to the famine and epidemic disease that followed. In the wake of sustained military activity, the social fabric that held communities together, the obligations between landlords and tenants, the functions of municipal courts and guilds, the networks of credit and exchange that allowed commerce to operate, proved more resilient in some places than others, but nowhere emerged from 3 decades of intermittent warfare entirely unchanged. The 30 Years' War is conventionally divided by historians into a sequence of overlapping phases, each marked by the entry of a new major power and a shift in the geographic and strategic character of the fighting. That periodization is a scholarly convenience rather than a precise description of events on the ground, where the experience of war was rarely so neatly organized, but it remains a useful framework for understanding how a localized constitutional revolt in Bohemia transformed, over 3 decades, into a continent-wide conflict that no single power was capable of either winning decisively or ending unilaterally. The Bohemian phase, which opened with the defenestration of 1618 and the subsequent election of the Calvinist Frederick V of the Palatinate as a rival king of Bohemia, ended swiftly and badly for the Protestant cause. At the Battle of White Mountain in November 1620, Habsburg and Catholic League forces defeated the Bohemian army in under 2 hours. Frederick V fled into exile. Bohemian Protestant nobles faced execution, exile, or the forced conversion of their estates. The letter of majesty that had protected Protestant worship was publicly torn apart by Ferdinand II himself. Historical evidence suggests that the speed and completeness of the Habsburg victory at this stage convinced the imperial court that a broader reimposition of Catholic authority across the empire was now achievable, a judgment that would prove seriously mistaken. The Danish phase that followed reflected the anxieties of Protestant powers watching Habsburg momentum build. King Christian IV of Denmark, motivated by a combination of religious solidarity and territorial ambition in northern Germany, intervened on behalf of the Protestant cause in 1625. The intervention failed. Danish forces were defeated repeatedly by the imperial army under Albrecht von Wallenstein, a Bohemian nobleman of extraordinary organizational talent who had offered to raise and supply a large army at his own expense in exchange for the authority to finance it through systematic extraction from occupied territories. By 1629, Denmark had withdrawn from the conflict under the terms of the Treaty of Lubeck. The same year, Ferdinand II issued the Edict of Restitution, an imperial decree demanding the return to Catholic control of all ecclesiastical properties. Secularized since 1552, the edict represented the high-water mark of Habsburg ambition and, simultaneously, one of the critical miscalculations of the war. It alarmed not only Protestant princes, but Catholic electors who had no interest in a Habsburg consolidation of imperial power so complete that it would render their own autonomy irrelevant. Sweden's entry into the war in 1630. Under King Gustav II Adolf shifted the balance decisively. The Swedish army was among the most professionally organized and tactically sophisticated forces in Europe, and Gustav Adolf proved a commander of genuine capability. Swedish forces won major engagements at Breitenfeld in 1631 and again at Reine and Lech in 1632. Gustav Adolf was killed at the Battle of Lutzen in November 1632, a Swedish tactical victory that nonetheless removed the war's most effective Protestant military leader at a critical moment. France's formal entry in 1635 completed the transformation of the conflict. Cardinal Richelieu, directing French foreign policy on behalf of Louis XIII, had been covertly subsidizing Sweden and other anti-Habsburg forces for years. France's open declaration of war against Spain brought the full weight of the Bourbon monarchy into a struggle that now extended well beyond its original religious dimensions. Administrative correspondence from the period makes clear that French strategic objectives were territorial and dynastic, the containment of Habsburg power along France's eastern and northern borders rather than confessional. Catholic France was now formally at war with Catholic Spain and the Catholic Emperor Dot by the 1640s. All major parties were exhausted. Wallenstein had been assassinated on imperial orders in 1634, suspected of conducting unauthorized peace negotiations. Swedish and French forces had demonstrated the capacity to strike deep into imperial territory, but not to impose a final settlement by force. Negotiations that would eventually produce a resolution had been underway, intermittently and inconclusively, since 1641. The negotiations that ended the 30 Years' War were themselves without precedent in European history. Conducted simultaneously in the Westphalian cities of Osnabrück and Munster over several years, they brought together delegations representing more than 100 political entities, kingdoms, principalities, free cities, ecclesiastical territories in what constituted the first major multilateral peace congress of the modern era. The treaties concluded in October 1648, collectively known as the Peace of Westphalia, did not resolve every dispute or satisfy every grievance, but they established a framework for coexistence that would shape European political order for generations. The territorial settlements were substantial. France gained significant territories along its eastern frontier, consolidating positions in Alsace that had strategic and symbolic importance for decades of subsequent diplomacy. Sweden secured territories along the Baltic and North Sea coasts, confirming its status as a major northern European power. The Dutch Republic, whose struggle for independence from Spain had run parallel to and intertwined with the larger war, received formal recognition of its sovereignty. The Swiss Confederation was similarly confirmed as independent of the empire. Within the empire itself, the authority of territorial princes was significantly strengthened relative to the emperor, and the constitutional balance that Westphalia codified would define imperial politics until the empire's dissolution in 1806, on the religious question that had done so much to ignite the conflict. The Peace of Westphalia extended formal recognition to Calvinist communities alongside the Lutheran and Catholic confessions already acknowledged under Augsburg. The principle that a prince could determine the religion of his territory was modified to fix religious arrangements as they had stood in 1624, limiting the capacity of rulers to impose conversions on established communities. Scholarly consensus holds that these provisions did not eliminate religious tension within the empire, but did establish a workable legal framework within which such tensions could be managed without automatically escalating to armed conflict. The human cost registered by the war resists precise quantification, but the broad contours established by historical research are not in serious dispute. Population losses across the territories of the Holy Roman Empire were severe and in some regions catastrophic. Estimates drawn from parish records, tax registers, and contemporary administrative surveys suggest that the German-speaking lands lost somewhere between a quarter and a third of their total population over the course of the conflict, figures that account for deaths from direct military violence, famine, and epidemic disease, as well as the displacement of populations that never returned. Regions that lay across major military corridors, Pomerania, Mecklenburg, large parts of Württemberg, and the Palatinate suffered losses at the higher end of that range. Recovery in the most affected areas required decades. The longer significance of the Peace of Westphalia has been the subject of sustained scholarly debate. A tradition of interpretation, influential particularly in the 20th century, identified Westphalia as the foundational moment of the modern international system, the point at which the sovereignty of states over their internal affairs became the organizing principle of relations between political entities. More recent scholarship has complicated that reading noting that the treaties themselves were embedded in the specific constitutional and legal culture of the empire and did not map cleanly onto later conceptions of state sovereignty. Primary sources from the period do not describe Westphalia in the terms that later theorists applied to it, but what is less contested is the war's role in demonstrating the limits of using military force to resolve the kind of deep, compounded disputes, constitutional, religious, dynastic, and territorial, that had accumulated across a century of unresolved tension. Neither the Habsburgs nor their opponents achieved the decisive, permanent settlements they had sought. What emerged instead was a negotiated order, imperfect and contested, but durable enough to hold the major European powers back from a comparable general conflict for the better part of a century. The 30 Years' War did not end the religious divisions, the dynastic rivalries, or the structural tensions of early modern Europe. What it demonstrated at enormous cost was that those tensions could not be resolved by exhausting an entire continent in the attempt.